again, thank you for being here, Saul. And please share anything else about your career because you bring a lot of perspective to our conversation today.
Well, thanks, Joseph and James, for having me. And hey, Robert Weichel, it's good to see you. Say hi to your mom and your brother for me.
I certainly will.
I've been a real estate broker in California since 1975. I got my sales license broker's license in 77, sales license in 75. I did a lot of the volunteer stuff at the local, state, and national level. I was on the first Realtor.com team when we built and deployed Realtor.com. I created a designation, and NAR has all these different designations that you can get. I created one called ePro for the National Association of Realtors. And also I was somebody who figured out that we needed to go to multiple listing services, aggregate the data, normalize the data, and distribute it to the appropriate channels. Some people think there are good channels and some people think there are not so good channels, but that's up to the brokers and agents to decide where they want that data and information sent. And I've been a real estate educator for years. So I have an extensive background. I've done lots of different things in real estate, including act as a teacher, instructor. And of course, the latest thing we're all interested in is this litigation, which really has been in the making for decades. And so this is not a new thing. This is something that's been building for, in my recollection, since the 1970s, actually. Wow. And so I would just start by saying that you read a lot, you hear about a lot. There's a lot of sensationalism, Joseph, as you mentioned. And at the same time, because we've got everybody's attention now, there's a lot of opportunity. And so now you got an opportunity to differentiate yourself from the competition. And we're always talking about that in real estate. We're always talking about what can you do different? How do you sell your services? How do you make yourself different? And one way is through knowledge and expertise. And a way to build trust and confidence in real estate sales relationships is to demonstrate expertise. So now the public is all becoming aware of real estate and of things that are very negative about real estate. Here's your opportunity to talk about these cases in an informative way. And a lot of your competitors can't talk about it, don't know about it, are unfamiliar with it. So great chance to learn a little bit about what's going on, be able to talk about it. And I think that's an opportunity because everybody's now starting to pay attention to real estate and people who list and sell real estate. That's not always a bad thing.
No, it's not, especially if it's approached in a way that can actually help people better understand and really make fans super fans if they really are clear of what all of this means and how it's actually a benefit to them for us to be involved. And you really thank you for that, those immediate thoughts, because I think everyone's pretty clear where we stand right now. We know what the decision was on that Stetzer case, and we know that we are in appeal, and we know that there's a lot of uncertainty between now and potentially years from now when these appeals are decided on. But with that in mind, it sounds like for the short term, because I think everyone wants to know what's going to change in the next 12 months. And Saul, I think you nailed it. In the next 12 months, what's likely going to change is just this awareness brought to the consumers. And therefore, the question immediately becomes, well, what should we do about it as agents?
Yeah, what should I do now? People want to know. What should I do now? And so my best advice is you should keep doing what you're doing. And you just continue to do the things that you're doing. That's what you should do now. And just add to that, gain some knowledge about what these cases are about. What's the history of them? And I'll go over a little bit if you like, exactly how this originated and where this came from. And then look to changes, because I actually believe that there's going to be what I've referred to for years, and you hear people talking about it that really don't know much about it, about a paradigm shift, right? There really is going to be a paradigm shift in the way in which we practice real estate at some point. And so a paradigm you're probably familiar with is a model. That's all it is. It's the way things are done. I just got back from Paris. I spoke in an MLS. Believe it or not, they don't have MLS in the rest of the world. North America, we have MLS. The rest of the world wants MLS. And so I was at an inaugural event, about 150 people put on by the NAR of Europe, CEPI, and the Real Estate Standards Organization. It was in Paris, France. It was a great event talking about MLS, multiple listing services, and the value of multiple listing services and what they bring to consumers. And they bring great value to consumers, and we need to be able to talk about this and talk about these values. So there is this litigation. There is a paradigm shift. The paradigm is a model. The example I gave in Paris was football. If you say football in Europe, it means one thing. And if you say football here in the United States, it means something completely different. All right. Same word, different paradigms, different models. And so the model in which we list and sell real estate and are compensated for that is through a multiple listing service and something called an offer of compensation, a unilateral offer of compensation. And this has its good side and its bad side. And so the way the MLS works is when you join the MLS, you agree that number one, you'll put all your listings in. That's a critical piece. You agree you'll put all your listings in. Why is that important? Because if I didn't have to put all my listings in, if I only had to put some in, I'd only put the lousy ones in probably. And then I would work to sell my good ones. I'd figure I don't really need anybody else to help me sell the other, my good ones. I'll sell my good ones. And then the ones I can't sell, then I'll ask for help. So the reason MLS works is we all trust that we're all going to put in all of our listings. Mm-hmm. And so we put all of our listings in, good and bad. And so that's this trust factor. And that's one of the things that makes MLS work. So it's an offer of compensation. And so you put your listings in, if somebody brings a buyer to your listing, that you're going to get paid if you represent the buyer. You don't need a contract with the buyer, as a matter of fact. And because you're a member of the MLS, you don't need a contract with the buyer. So one of the things that you should start to do now is figure out ways to convince buyers that having a contract with you is a valuable thing. And again, we haven't had to do that because we're members of the MLS. We know that we're going to get compensated if we bring a buyer. And so I was kind of afraid. I didn't want to ask a buyer to sign a contract because I know my friend Robert Weichel, he might not ask somebody to sign a contract. And if he didn't and I did, then people might not want to do business with me. So we haven't really adopted in a big way the use of buyer contracts, but it's important that we start to look at that, because when this paradigm shifts, and when the shift is going to be probably that the offer of compensation, the broker compensation clause of MLS will no longer be. And so MLS will probably not be an offer of compensation any longer. Now, if you go historically, it's interesting to note that the offer of compensation really has only been part of the MLS since 1996. And so now here's another interesting point. MLS, we have rules for most of our MLSs that are promulgated by the National Association of Realtors. The National Association of Realtors doesn't have an MLS. It doesn't have an MLS. And yet it makes up rules for MLSs. Why? Because the National Association of Realtors has figured out what I'll refer to as best practices, and says, look, if you're an association and you own an MLS, or you belong to an MLS owned by many associations, then if you follow our NAR rules, we'll cover you with our errors and omission insurance. So we'll give your MLS insurance. So now if you're a local association of realtors and you have an MLS, do you want that insurance from the National Association of Realtors? And the answer is you probably do.
Yep.
And so to get that insurance, you have to comply with the rules. So that's just an important distinction. NAR, National Association of Realtors, doesn't have an MLS, but it has rules. If your local association follows the rules, then you're covered by the errors and omission insurance. Now, prior to 1996, there's an important concept I'll call a compensation vehicle. So one of the things that makes MLSs effective is a compensation vehicle. And prior to 1996, the compensation vehicle for MLSs was an offer of subagency. And some of you might remember this. prior to 1996, we all represented the seller. Does anybody remember that? When we all represented the seller in real estate transactions? And you say, well, why did we all represent the seller? And the answer is because we were all members of the MLS. And when we joined the MLS, we all represented the seller because we became sub-agents of the listing broker. So the listing broker took the listing and then put it in the MLS, and then we all became sub-agents, and that allowed the compensation to flow. So it would flow from the seller to the person who represented the seller to the sub-agents. And so that was the compensation model. But then what happened is, now this was interesting, nobody represented the buyer.
Yes. And was that an issue? Is that why we no longer operate in that system?
Well, so not only did nobody represent the buyer, nobody had to tell the buyer they weren't represented. And so we got this consumer push to disclose relationships. And the result of this consumer push to disclose relationships was something that we called agency disclosure. And agency disclosure became the law first in California in 1986, and it became required in 1988, and then it spread throughout the rest of the country. And so now all of a sudden you had to disclose who you represented in a real estate transaction. We never had to do that before. And so we didn't really know what that meant. And in California, there were 3 ways to represent people in real estate transactions. You could represent the seller exclusively. Well, the listing agent knew that. You could represent the buyer exclusively. People weren't sure about that. Or you could represent both as a dual agent.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to make that disclosure. Well, if you were an agent, say you just got your license, even though you took the class on disclosure, if you weren't the listing agent, you might think, well, since I'm not the listing agent, I guess I represent the buyer. Logically, right? I don't. And so you sign this disclosure statement, you check the box that said you represented the buyer exclusively. Well, the fact is you didn't represent the buyer exclusively. You represented the seller.
Yes,
because
as the sub-agent.
You were part of the MLS, and the MLS was an offer of sub-agency. So now you're guilty of something called divided agency, where you told one party you represented them exclusively and you didn't. And that's dangerous territory, because people can go back and they can sue and they can disgorge commission. And this was a dilemma. And so the MLS rules had to change, and they had to come up with a new compensation vehicle. And so the new compensation vehicle that was created was an offer of compensation. And so we eliminated the sub-agency model, and we moved to the offer of compensation model, and it's worked very well since 1996.
And Saul, is it true that buyer representation, not only did it become clearer, it became more available simply because agents were literally focused on the buy side needs, their wants, and what they were trying to pursue. So we've had a pretty balanced risk as far as buyer and seller.
You're absolutely right. So now with the MLS rules change, prior to the big change, there were only a few people that would represent buyers in real estate transactions. People didn't know how to represent buyers in real estate transactions, because if you were a member of the MLS, how could you represent a buyer when you were an agent of the seller? Well, there was an answer, but nobody knew the answer. The answer was you refute the unilateral offer of sub-agency. But if you ask an attorney, how do you refute the unilateral offer of sub-agency? Nobody could tell you, because nobody did it. And so buyer agency was rare prior to 1990. So this rule change kind of opened it up, and it gave buyers representation. And this was a great consumer move. And so now consumers could be represented in real estate transactions as buyers, and it was a great move. And that's what now is under attack. Yes. So what we did as an industry to protect consumers is now under attack. And if you look at it, it's like they breached the walls, right? It's like the hordes are coming over the walls. We've got lawsuit after lawsuit, and what's being attacked is the offer of compensation. That really was a great consumer move 30 years ago or so.
Yep.
And so today we've got, and so now you're all familiar with, you've heard about it, the Sitzer case. And I think the more you know about this, the more you can talk about it, the better off you're going to be. One of the ways to build trust and confidence in a sales relationship is to demonstrate expertise, and demonstrate expertise in this thing everybody's talking about. So there are many major cases, but the way I explain it is there are three major cases. And then there's the big case, which is the Department of Justice against the National Association of Realtors. And that's kind of a side case. So in these the three major cases, which are now really 4 major cases, 5 major cases, 6 major cases, they are civil cases. It's civil litigation. It's antitrust. And you know how deathly afraid we are of antitrust in real estate. As soon as somebody mentions commissions, everybody walks out of the room. And so now we've got big time conversations about commissions and antitrust. And so we've got 3, and again, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but 3 major cases that civil litigation, antitrust litigation, and class action. Class action. And so this means the attorneys are involved. They're defining classes of people who are entitled to compensation for being damaged for violation of the law. And so the 3 cases that we're all familiar with that have grown, and we don't need to talk about, and I can provide you all documents if you want that'll indicate what the new cases are. But the 3 cases were first Merrill in Illinois, and it affects major brokerage firms and major MLSs. You know, Keller Williams, Remax, Anywhere, which is the old Realogy, which is Coldwell Banker, Century 21. You know, EXP has been named in these, all the major brokerage firms and major MLSs. Merrill, big case. And then we'll go to trial in early 2024, I think. Then the case we're all familiar with now is Setzer, with Setzer Burnett, which is in Missouri. And that case was judged here, went to trial recently, and that's the one we all know about. First, because there was proposed settlement by Remax for $55 million, and by
Anywhere
for 83.5 million. And then there was judgment of 1 point, so that they went to trial, like 12-day trial, 2 hour took 2 hours for the jury to come up with a decision. It was judged on a per se basis, as opposed to, and this is another term, right, as opposed to a rule of reason basis. And the judgment was $1.78 billion. And because it's antitrust, it'll be treble damages, $5 billion. And that's the first case. Now it will be appealed, and but there's no guarantee what'll happen on the appeal. And before there can be an appeal, there has to be a bond posted by the defendants. And this is all in the process, and we're going to hear more about it over the coming months. And again, in the meantime, what should you do? Exactly what you're doing. Keep listing and selling real estate. Keep prospecting. Keep talking to people. Keep making contact with people. And learn about these cases so you can have informed discussions about them with consumers when they ask you about them. Because there will come a point in time because remember, what's been challenged here is the offer of compensation. So in these cases, what the plaintiffs said was, I didn't know I didn't have to pay commission to the buyer's agent. I know you might have told me, but I didn't know. And because I didn't know, I think that I probably could have paid a lot less. And so I've been damaged.
Yep.
And I've been damaged to the tune of, in this particular case, with the way they determined the damage, they said, and I'm going to make the number up. They said over the last 5 years, this is true, like over the last 5 years, X number of real estate transactions have closed. And the commission on the buy side, let's say, was 2.5%. And that shouldn't have been paid. So 2.5% times the number of transactions over the last 5 years equals $1.78 billion.
But because it's antitrust, we're going to triple that number.
And because it's antitrust, we're going to triple it. right?
So you and I have had a conversation. We'll get to that in a moment about determining damages, because it's a really interesting way in which they've approached this. And I think there's a lot of argument to be made that the way that the real estate community has leveraged the offer for compensation as a way to make sure that the exposure to that home actually yields the seller a really positive net number, that there is a way to look at damages again and question, did they really lose X amount of deals over the last 5 years times 2.5%? Because if you would not have had that offer for compensation, what might you have actually sold that home for versus what it actually sold for?
So, Joseph, that's a great point. And I will just throw this in for fun.
Okay.
Okay.
I like fun.
Yeah. So while that's all true, it's been a seller's market. And because it's been a seller's market, it will cloud that argument in my mind.
Potentially.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. So it's like I'm a seller, and I say, first of all, you just disclosed to me I don't have to pay somebody on a buyer's, I don't have to pay the agent who's negotiating against me. You know what? I don't want to pay the agent who's negotiating against me, because I know if I put a sign in the ground, I'm going to get 20 offers on my property in the first hour. They're all going to be over the list price, and people are even going to waive inspections.
So, Saul, let's take that a step further, because I think you're spot on. Okay. How will we get 20 offers if the buyers don't have anyone to represent them and structure a decent offer? How do we get 20 offers? Do they go directly to the listing agent? Is that the question?
So now,
Is that the idea?
yeah. So is the question, or is this a step backwards potentially?
Yes.
Because exactly where you're going to go. I'm a seller. I don't know that much. I'm going to have somebody, I'll hire an agent. I'll say, put it in Zillow, put a sign in the ground. Everybody's going to see it. And buyers, if nobody's going to pay somebody who represents the buyer, which by the way, it's another conversation, because you need to be able to figure out how to talk to buyers about paying you a compensation. I got this up at NAR. I don't know, these 179 ways a real estate agent earns their money. There's a great pamphlet or brochure. It's got a lot of great information. I used to call it a menu of services. You need to figure out what your menu of services is. You need to be able to articulate that to buyers. You're well worth the money. Now but with the MLS structured the way it was, you never had to make the case.
Yep.
Now you have to make the case, right? So what happens is, you're right, Joseph. Somebody might say, well, look, just put it on the market and let the buyers come to you. Well, if the buyers come to the listing agent, now what's probably going to happen is it's a dual agency, and now we've got a limited representation on both sides. And is that in the best interest of the buyer and seller? So that's a debate that probably would need to be had again.
I agree. And here's what's really interesting, Saul, because if the seller and the listing agent decided, you're going to list my home and I'm going to pay you 3%, just a arbitrary number, 2%, whatever they decide, okay, that you're going to represent the sale of my home and my interest as the seller. And then 20 buyers come to the agent and say, well, I want to buy this home. So someone needs to write up an offer for me. If the listing agent writes up an offer for a buyer and says, well, hey, listen, I need compensation to do work for you as the buyer, right? And I'm putting my brokerage at risk of going through a transaction. Like, there needs to be some sort of compensation for this professional service, okay? And the agent and the buyer decide, okay, I'm willing to do it for you for $1,000. Let's just say. So they're going to make their 2 to 2.5 to 3 to 1%, whatever they decided with the seller, and $1,000 to represent the buyer. Is it not true, though, that that is equal representation? So my concern there as a listing agent, when I hear all these possibilities, is, wait a minute, I'm opening myself up for litigation from sellers who said, time out, in the future, I paid you 2.5% to represent my home. And then I see that it only cost the buyer $1,000 in this scenario to have equal representation. Now I want to sue you because I way overpaid for your representation. be it that you only charge the buyer $1,000. Is there a world in which that would make sense, Saul? Should the, let's just call it worst case scenario, happen with the result of all this litigation?
Well, that's a possibility.
Uh-huh.
And part of where the conversation needs to go is really and truly the seller doesn't pay the compensation and neither does the buyer. The transaction pays the compensation. Without the seller, there's no compensation. Without the buyer, there's no compensation. So I think we've been remiss in our description of who pays the compensation.
Sure.
It's really the transaction that generates the compensation. And that's a fact we have to get used to, because we're also then going to be concerned with how is the compensation paid? How do you get it financed in the transaction, right? There are a lot of extenuating circumstances. Now, in your case, the case that you mentioned, the fact that one party gets paid a different amount could result in grounds for litigation, although it's not unusual necessarily for one party to get paid one amount and another party to get paid another amount. So in a world where there is no offer of compensation through the multiple listing service, if I were to take a listing, I might coach the seller. I might say to the seller, here's how it works. I'm going to represent you in a transaction. Here's how much I'm going to charge. In the event a buyer comes in and they're not represented, I would like then to have the capability to represent them and you as a dual agent, in which case you're going to get limited representation. They're going to get limited representation. And by the way, since I'm representing both parties, instead of the amount we're agreeing upon here, I would like to get paid this much, a little bit more than that. And remember, it's the transaction that's generating the revenue, however, the commission, however it happens to get split,
Right.
and not one side to the other. So,
right, because Saul, it's really interesting when sellers say, well, I pay the commission. Well, how much money do you put into escrow? Because I get it that it comes from the proceeds of the sale, but that's the buyer's money who comes into the transaction. So I think that's a really great way to start that dialogue, that the transaction pays the compensation.
it's an age-old argument. We all have, in real estate education circles, have been debating this for years, right? It's the seller pays the commission because it comes off the closing sale. The buyer, well, if there's no buyer, there's no deal. They go out and get the financing. That's where it comes from. And the fact is, it's neither. It's both. It's the transaction. And that's the way we want it looked at, because if it's the transaction that's actually going to get financed, right? Because part of the worry here is the buyer doesn't have enough cash to pay a buyer's agent, because they're worried about down payment and closing costs and the VA loans and the FHA loans the buyer can't, right? So we're worried about that. Well, the fact is we got to start moving the dialogue, the conversation to it's the transaction that generates this, right? And then look at the upside and the downside to the result of this litigation for consumers on both sides. And right now, what we're only looking at are the damages awarded by that jury in a case where the judge made the decision that the jury should make their decision based on what they refer to as per se. In other words, it's I don't even want to hear about all the good stuff that your system does. It's illegal. It's a violation of the antitrust law just because of the way it's set up, per se. Now, don't give me the other side of that. The other way you judge antitrust cases is rule of reason. Yeah, well, maybe we're bending the rules a little bit here, but look at all the good stuff it does. Look at the benefit it does, right? And so that would be a better way from an industry and my perspective and a consumer's perspective to judge this. But that's not the way this case was judged. And this is just one case, right?
Now, Saul, when it comes to appeal, will appeal be that same per se, or will that be a more thorough and robust understanding of the nuance that happens in a real estate transaction?
I believe that part of the appeal will be it shouldn't have been decided per se.
Okay.
Right. That will be part of the appeal, that it should have been more of a rule of reason approach to this. And that's not the position that the judge took when he instructed the jury.
Now, Saul, you have a great recommendation when it comes to what needs to be done now. And what needs to be done now is really twofold that you mentioned. One, business as usual. And yet number two, really getting clear on what value you bring to both sides of the equation on a transaction and being able to properly communicate them. But I want to go back to point number one, which is business as usual. There's a lot of people, especially online, there's some keyboard warriors out there that are really poo-pooing on the National Association of Realtors and even their state association of realtors. And we know that there could be this movement moving forward across the country where we are going to unhinge all three of those groupings, right? Where if you're a part of a local board, that automatically makes you a part of the state board and the national board, bringing them together, and that we may unhinge those things. Let's talk a little bit about, if you would, what repercussions could happen if we as agents start to unhinge ourselves from working with our state association and the national association. Like, what could that mean for us as agents and even for consumers?
Well, you hit a lot of points there. So the keyboard warrior, I have a statement that I make about the internet, and that is that it's full of people who are not always right, but never in doubt.
I've heard it another way, Saul. I've heard someone say the internet was a mistake. It could be.
Yeah, well, so a lot of people, they're not always right, but they're never in doubt. So you got a lot of people that'll argue with you till the cows come home, and they have no idea what they're arguing about. They have no expertise, no knowledge, and it's like a waste of time to even talk to those people. So so to take that to the next point, and that is the realtor organization is three levels: state, national, state, and local. And there's something called the three-way agreement. The three-way agreement means you join the local, you also join the state, and you also join the national. You can't just join one. You don't have that choice. Be you a broker or an agent, you can't say, I'm only joining the California Association of Realtors. I'm not joining my local. You can't. I'm only joining my local. You can't. If the rule is, these all kind of think of the National Association of Realtors as a franchise. And it gives state franchises and local franchises. And when you buy in, you buy in. And so in many states, if you want access to the MLS, you have to be a realtor. That's not the case in California, but that's the case in many states. Also, if you want to use the forms, and I don't know about you, but I believe, at least here in California, that the California Association of Realtors puts out the best real estate forms you're ever going to find. They protect you. How did we put those? I remember the day. I mean, I've been selling in the real estate business. I haven't sold real estate for other people in many years, but I remember the day when the form was one page and you had to fill in the blanks. Then you'd hear that of an agent or broker down the street got sued for something. Then you'd add a disclosure to your form because somebody got sued, and then somebody else got sued, and you'd add that to pretty soon you'd had all these addendums to your contract. And then CAR started, they say, let's just have a committee. And they've brought the best real estate attorneys, the best experience from brokers. They create the best forms for us to utilize that protect us when we list and sell real estate. And if you're not a member, you can't use the forms, or you'll pay extra to use the forms. So why would you uncouple yourself from this great risk reduction capability? And so the idea that people don't want to participate at the national level, they just probably haven't participated themselves and don't realize the value that comes through the National Association of Realtors. Do you like the home interest deduction? That's because of the National Association of Realtors. Do you like being an independent contractor? That's because of the National Association of Realtors. Do you like 1031 tax deferred exchanges? That's still around to the degree that it is because of the National Association of Realtors. Do you like not having so many point of sale issues when you sell real estate in your local market? That's probably because of your local Association of Realtors. It's amazing if you look at all the things that organized real estate does, and for the amount of money you pay to be a member, it's pennies on the dollar. In my career, I was also a certified financial planner. So I also sold stocks and bonds and mutual funds and gave people financial advice. And I was a member of the College for Financial Planning, and I paid a lot more dues to that organization than I did to my realtor organization for a lot less benefit. And so we receive amazing benefits from our organizations at all levels. I think if you went through and you looked at them, you would find it's well worth what you pay. So the conversations around breaking it apart, first of all, you and I can't do it. If we want to be realtors, we have to belong to all three. Now, we might decide we don't want to be realtors, but we might have to give up forms. In some states, we might have to give up MLS.
Mhm.
And so it doesn't come without a cost. And again, I'm an advocate for organized real estate. I put a lot of volunteer hours in, and I believe in the good that it does. And yeah, they don't do NAR and CAR and even my local association. I don't always agree with the things that it does. But by and large, I agree with the result that we've been able to obtain over the years. And
Even
now,
that's true for consumers, right? Because I think that the American way for the consumers has really, NAR has been instrumental in trying to create as much as possible that open market for real estate's value to go where it's supposed to go in terms of, people having an interest and a willingness to spend what they're going to spend to own real estate. Without NAR, the consumer could have a pretty dramatic impact in how real estate's done here in America.
well, so you're absolutely right. So one of the things that's nearest and dearest to my heart are private property rights. And so I believe in private property. I believe in the benefits of participating and owning real estate. I think that we're a better country when people own real estate. I believe we're better citizens when people own real estate. I believe in private property rights, and there is no greater advocate for private property rights than our realtor organizations. And so if you believe in private property rights, you tell me who's fighting for private property rights. Again, I live in California. Their private property rights disappear left and right almost on a daily basis. It's insane. And so who fights for private property rights? Our realtor organizations do. Now, we have political action committees, and you can contribute your money, and most people don't contribute very much to the political action committees, and I'm an advocate for that. And I believe people should give to RPAC, to the Realtor Political Action Committee. Give as much as you feel comfortable giving. I personally give every year, have for years. I've obtained the highest levels of giving. Why? Because I own real estate. I believe in private property rights, and I want somebody to fight for private property rights, and there isn't anybody left fighting for private property rights.
It's funny, Saul, because when things are great and we're all doing wonderful, we don't think about that. But now when we're in a scenario like we are now, hopefully this is a wake-up call for everyone, not only on this call, but across the country as realtors. This is why we want to be consistent in that contribution, because it's not only about the bad times, it's about making sure there's the good times that come back, in terms of, there being a large body out there really fighting for those ownership rights that you're talking about.
Yeah, there are forces out there that don't believe people should own real estate.
Yeah.
Now, you might think that's a conspiracy or a conspiracy theory, but it's true. There are entities out there and people out there that don't believe people should have the right to own their own real estate. And I've personally seen it. My parents own their own home. My grandparents own their home. We all know this, right? It's a way to build generational wealth. Everybody should be given the opportunity to own it. And we've got the greatest market in the world, and everybody wants to. Real estate's almost a liquid asset. I mean, it's like you don't have to buy it and worry that you're never going to be able to sell it. And why is it almost a liquid asset? And the answer is multiple listing services. And what holds the multiple listing service together? The offer of compensation. It's being challenged. How do we hold the MLS together without that offer? And I'll say that the offer of compensation also protects the incompetence, right? And so I could be a brand new agent with no experience at all. I happen to get a buyer. I take them in and sell them a piece of property, right? And I get paid as much commission as a qualified, and I don't know anything. So the listing agent has to do all the work. But I still get paid the same amount of money. And so there are flaws to the system, but it's the best system in the world. And like I said, people want it everywhere. And again, I was just in Europe, and it was interesting listening to the way they sell real estate there. No exclusive listings, all open listings. Think about that. Non-exclusive listing to many brokers. So if you're a seller and you want exposure, you list with 100 brokers, because then you're going to get exposure. if you're a buyer and you want to see a good sampling of what's available, you have to go to a number of brokers, because brokers will only show the properties they have listed. There is really no buyer representation to speak of, and there is no exclusive on the sell side. And so the things that you need to create an MLS don't exist. And consequently, you have ineffective markets, to the point where you got people now crying for MLS, which is why they had this, first time ever, a conference of people in Paris to get together and share ideas about how can you create MLS in the rest of the world. And here we are trying to destroy it on our side.
That's exactly it. In fact, that was part of the argument made in, if I'm not mistaken, Setzer Burnett, is that, hey, the rest of the world operates without this type of, MLS requirement with this, compensation. But yet, if you ask the rest of the world, they want to emulate what we're doing here. So it's really strange that both are happening at the same time, where the rest of the world wants to emulate America, and yet that's being used against us in litigation. Like, well, the rest of the world doesn't need this.
Well, so it's kind of interesting. So number one, the rest of the world has a lot of dual agency. And a lot of people would tell you dual agency isn't to the benefit of the consumer, but the rest of the world, that's typically what you got, because if you want to buy the real estate, you go directly to the listing agent. Now, the rest of the world doesn't really want it. Certain factions do. But then there are people that still want to keep things secret, kind of like our commercial real estate world, right? And so there are still a lot of people that will fight this in the rest of the world, right? Say, we don't want it. We still want to have our silos. If it's our listing, we still want to be able to make commissions on both sides. Why in the world would we want to share commissions with anybody else? But one of the things that we're going to see here, I think, in the next year or so, maybe a little bit longer, is the uncoupling, right? Where the MLS, that compensation vehicle, which was once an offer of subagency that became an offer of compensation, that will go by the wayside. And what people will have to do is they'll have to prove their worth to a buyer and get the buyer to sign the contract. And the compensation will evolve through the transaction, as it always has. But you're going to have to make your case, and that might mean lower commissions for a while, unless you can make the case for a higher one, right? I remember when I was listing and selling real estate, was through one of the downturns. I was listing for some ungodly amount, more than other people were listing for, and people would say, "Well, how come you're listing for X plus 2 when everybody else will list for X?" And I would always say, "Well, they list, I sell." Right? So they'll list it, but and they put it on market and it'll sit there forever, but I'm gonna put it on the market and I'm gonna sell it for you, right? So, but you had to make your case, and you're gonna have to make your case to buyers, and the structure of MLS hasn't required that you make your case to the buyer in order to be compensated. And that's part of the consumer argument, and I understand that.
Yeah, that makes sense. On some level, that does make sense. I just don't think anyone recognizes all of the unintended consequences here. And for lack of a better term, let's talk a little bit of conspiracy, since you brought it up. Where did all this litigation really come from, Saul? Like, there are some people out there who are concerned that, these fintech companies and some of these other large organizations that want to do away with the agent had a little nudge to get some of this rolling. Is there any evidence, any ideas there for you, or where is the origins of all of this? Because you said you've seen this for decades.
Yeah, so there actually is an FTC report, and you can get it off my website. 1983, the Federal Trade Commission put out a state of the residential real estate industry report. So there have been people, Consumer Federation of America, for one. If you go to Consumer Federation of America, or CFA probably.org, and you read their take on these cases, it's much different than our take on these cases. So there have been entities pushing this for years. And then, of course, there are opportunistic attorneys behind this, and the fact that the market was really good, and because the market was really good, it made it much easier to make the case that you really didn't need an agent on the buy side. But the conspiracies where you hear people talking about some of the technology firms or the portals are behind this, I don't believe that at all, right? So let's take as an example Zillow or CoStar Oh, they want to no, they make their money from real estate agents. They get their inventories directly from the multiple listing services. If Zillow didn't get its listings, if homes.com didn't get their listings from the MLS, where would they get them? And the answer is they'd have to go out and get individual contracts with brokers and agents, or individual contracts with MLSs, so they become brokers. This is why Zillow didn't become a broker to get into your business. Zillow became a broker because it became impossible for Zillow to get listings for the website any other way. The easiest way to get listings for display on the internet is to be a broker and to get what we refer to as an IDX feed, Internet Data Exchange. And if you're a broker, you're entitled to an IDX feed. Zillow wasn't the broker. I was the CEO of a company that went out to MLSs, got contracts with MLSs, and distributed through syndication those listings. I sold that company. That company then sold to Realtor.com. And then Realtor.com cut off the listings to Zillow. And so if you're Zillow and all of a sudden your source of listings gets cut off, what are you going to do? You're going to try to get a new source of listings. What's the way to get the listings directly from the MLS? You become a broker and you get an IDX feed. Same with homes.com. Homes.com had contracts with listing syndicators. There were two big listing syndication companies at one time. I was the CEO of one of them. One was ListHub, the other was Point Two Technologies. And I was the CEO of Point Two. And we would go out and get the data from MLSs. We would normalize the data and feed it to the portals where agents wanted it to. So portals would get this data. When those got sold and Realtor.com ended up controlling all the syndication feeds, then companies that had portals had to figure out ways to get the data. And the easiest way to do it is just become a broker in every state, join every MLS, get an IDX feed from every MLS. And so if there were no MLSs, homes.com, Zillow, Trulia, they would lose their inventories. They would lose what brings people to their website. They would lose their abilities to generate revenue using their current revenue models. And so I don't believe any of that, right? I don't believe that it's been pushed by the portals. It's not common sense when you know how valuable the MLSs are
for them,
to these entities. Yeah.
And see, that's that unique perspective that I don't think anyone else has the ability to formulate, because they haven't been involved not only for the amount of time and the changes of our market, like you've been through some significant ones, but also like where you were in some of that transition, literally being the CEO of one of those companies. So that's again why we're so honored to have you on here today, Saul, to give us that better perspective. One quick note I want to make about, you mentioned the standardized forms. What I think a lot of people don't recognize is there are some entities, even in California, already trying to prep for the elimination of standardized forms through the California Association of Realtors. And what I want everyone to recognize, and this is again, where not only is this going to be a challenge for us as agents, but more importantly for consumers. Saul, what happens if I use a form from, I don't know, let's just call it XYZ coaching company to send to you because you're the listing agent and I'm representing a buyer, and then you counteroffer with a different form that's not of my standardized forms, but one of yours? What does that mean for the agent? Because now we're reading contracts, and if we need to interpret them, then that sounds like it's outside of our purview as a licensed agent or even broker. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd be very careful about that, because there are certain standards of practice that everybody should live up to. And if you don't, you become liable, even more liable. And so if the standard of practice is to use standardized forms from the California Association of Realtors, and you're using a form that's not up to the standard of practice, then you just increase your liability. Better check on your Arizona emission insurance and what you're covered for. And you might, and matter of fact, I think that's a valuable thing for people to do. Check your E&O right now. What does your E&O cover you for? What doesn't it cover you for? And how much are you covered? To what degree are you covered? But I guarantee you that if you're not living up to the standard of care, you're more liable. And part of the standard of care is using the forms that everybody's using, and they're the safest thing for you to do. So if I were to be presented a counteroffer on a form that's not a standardized form in my market, I would go to my broker, is what I would do. And I would ask my broker for some guidance.
Well, let's move forward and say that in a scenario where California Association of Realtors, NAR, they're no longer existent, and there's no more standardized form per se or a need for one. What does that mean for agents? Because we really should not ever interpret a contract for somebody else. That's someone else's job, right? An attorney. And what could that mean for the consumer then? Because now if they need to hire attorneys to interpret contracts for them, doesn't that mean the cost of a transaction goes through the roof?
Well, so there's, first of all, there is a need for forms, for contracts.
Sure.
And what our associations have done at the state level is they've made it possible for people without law degrees to put real estate deals together. If those forms don't exist, the option for the consumer is to go to an attorney for the transaction. Now, would that cost more than the current commission structures? Yeah, I don't know, but it's, if you think about this, it's not necessarily, no, some states require attorneys for closings, right? So they're already part of the game. What keeps attorneys out of most real estate sales, at least in my market in California, is a standardized form. And so it makes it easier for people to list and sell real estate. It makes it easier for consumers to find people who can help them in real estate transactions. And you're right, unless you have a law degree and are licensed to practice law, you want to be very careful about what you might do, even with a standardized form, changes you might make. Now you bring this idea to my mind, this takes it to the next level. We won't talk about it, but when AI is introduced to this, where does all this go? Right? A whole nother conversation.
Well, Saul, let's do this because I do, if you're okay with it, we might go a little bit long, but I want to open it up for some people to have questions. But my last question before we open it up, and this is my warning to everyone else, get ready to ask a question or two. But Saul, if you were to, and this is just, being very clear that no one knows what's going to happen next. No one knows how this will all settle. But if you could, based on all of your experiences, your tremendous amount of knowledge, what is your best guess as to what this looks like in the next 5 to 10 years? Aside from some of the other, changes that could happen, but just strictly this litigation, what do you anticipate will be the likely outcome?
I would guess that the offer of compensation disappears through the MLS. And so you're no longer going to be able, if you represent buyers, to be compensated by the listing broker. That's going to change. Now, it could go further. I don't think so, but it could go to where the courts and the FTC decide sellers are not going to be allowed to pay commissions to the buy side. I think that's almost unconstitutional. So I don't see it going there. But I do see the fact that the listing broker can negotiate the commission on the buy. That's going to go away. And so what people are going to have to do is figure out a way to describe the value they bring to the transaction to a buyer and a new compensation model. So I'll give you a look at a different compensation model. One of the greatest skills that you can bring to a buyer is the ability to negotiate. And your ability to negotiate is based on a number of things. One of them is knowing the market and knowing the area in which you're selling real estate, and maybe even knowing the house because you've listed it and sold it a couple times before. And so your ability to negotiate is critical. What if your compensation were calculated on the savings that you bring to the buyer? What if the buyer could look at a listing that's available anywhere and say, the seller wants this amount. It's a seller's market, so I know they're going to get this amount higher. I'll pay this. Or it's not a buyer, it's a buyer's market. So here they're listing it for this. I know I could pay this. And then you could bid as an agent to say, I think I can get that property for you for this. And if I can get it for you for this, I want 50% of the savings that I can get because I negotiated a better price for you.
It's almost a net listing on the buy side.
Kind of, but not quite. And here's what this does, because this is kind of interesting, that commission buyers, buyer agent commissions really work in the reverse interest. And we know that people don't act this way, but they work to the reverse interest of the buyer. The higher the sale price, the more commission the buyer's agent makes.
Mm-hmm.
That's in reverse interest to the interest of the buyer.
Interesting.
So, but if the lower the price, the more you got. Now the agent is incentivized in direct relationship to the interest of the buyer, because now the buyer wants to get it for a lower price and the buyer's agent wants to get it for a lower price. And so now there's an alignment and it's negotiable. Okay, I'll take 30% of the savings or 25%. And look at these cases today. What's being said is there's no negotiating taking place. And so new models might push for more negotiating in ways that we've not thought of in the past. And so what do I see the future? I see it unfolding where you're going to have to figure out new ways to be compensated on the buy side. And if nothing else, you're going to need a contract on the buy side, because without a contract, you're not going to have any guarantee of being compensated. And if the listing agent's not, offering consideration, and you don't have a written contract, and the buyer just gives you a verbal, well, we all know statute of frauds, right? And we're going to have issues if all we've got is verbal agreements with buyers.
Yep.
That they'll pay us a commission. And then the contract's got to stipulate somehow that the payment of the commission isn't going to come out of the buyer's pocket. It's going to come out of what? The transaction. So it can get financed. And so that's kind of the way I see it moving. Anticipate that you'll no longer, as a member of the MLS, be guaranteed that you're going to get compensation.
I'm just writing this down because knowing and communicating your value is of top importance. And then I think all of us better brush up on our negotiation skills times 1,000 moving forward.
Yeah, your interest as a buyer representative now need to be, and now we can start thinking, and that's been part of this case, right? More aligned with the interest of the buyer.
Well, and if that is the case, then listing agents better brush up on their negotiation abilities as well and understanding the dynamics. It's going to cause us to be either very, very astute professionals and specialists in understanding the transaction, the process, and the navigation there within. Because I think even at this point, Saul, the people who better understand their contracts are the better negotiators anyway.
Sure.
So our ability to understand those, the entire transaction and the navigation there within, based on the contract, is going to give you that leg up in negotiation.
Yeah, and just to add, compensation is not the only, or price not the only element in successful negotiation, right? We know that. Sure. Terms of sale, occupancy, there are a number of different things that if you think about the future, the buyer could say, here's the important things to me. And then you might be able to be scored on how well you delivered in those areas, and compensation calculated on that, on those features, not just how much less than the price were you able to get the property for.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you said that, by the way. That makes a lot of sense, because as you mentioned, it's not always about price. There are other factors, obviously, that are important to our clients. And if there's a way to measure them as like a level of success, therefore your compensation is accordingly, that could be an interesting new model. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I don't think a lot of us understand how to have new models. We're so entrenched in this one. When it goes away, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of other paths forward, but it sounds like there are, which is great news. There's always a way forward.
The paradigm is shifting.
Yep.
paradigm shift is a fundamental change. When a paradigm shifts, everyone goes back to zero. Your past success guarantees nothing when a paradigm shifts. In fact, often your past success will blind you from seeing the future.
Now, Saul, do you have about 5 more minutes for a couple of quick questions before we wrap for the day? I want to be very respectful of your time as well as everyone else.
I do, sure.
Okay, great. Does anyone have a really pressing question that they got to ask? Okay, go for it. Bruce, hi there.
Yeah, I have a particular interest in the law, and I really have appreciated this presentation. So I wanted to ask you if you had a sense, this is going to go to appeal, and I assume that it may or may not go to a jury trial on appeal. It would probably, it's going to be a 3-judge appeal trial, correct? So it seemed to me that your argument that in effect what the current offer of compensation paradigm is doing is really compensating people already. It's compensating people from the transaction. And I mean, can't that argument really be logically made? It seems like, the voice of reason may mitigate this at the appeals level. Do you think differently? I mean, do you really think there's a long shot of winning at an appeal on this? It doesn't seem like a reasonable verdict as what's been said, so I'm interested in your opinions on that.
Yeah. So I agree. I don't think it's a reasonable verdict. And at the same time, I'm not real hopeful as to the outcome of the appeal. I don't know if that answers the question. Appeals are so narrow often that I'm not sure that the avenues for which NAR is looking to appeal are going to give them enough room to maneuver. Now, at the same time, the FTC and the DOJ might figure out that there's more damage than benefit here, and might at some point step in with regulation. And so, here's a kind of a hopeful thought. When I look the settlements, what were the two settlements? 55 million and 83.5 million. Those were the two settlement amounts. Those two amounts, and the judges found those in the Sitzer cases, found those to be reasonable. Well, when you look at that, and then you look at the size of the judgment, 5 billion. If 2/3 of the defendants are making a reasonable settlement with 120 million, what does that say about what the judge thinks about the actual settlement, the actual judgment amount of 1.78 billion tripled? Kind of seems to me that the judge, in accepting these which seem to be meager settlements, is that the judge, at least in the Sitzer case, isn't in total agreement that the judgment is a reasonable judgment. So where that goes on appeal, I don't know. Again, I'm not hopeful on the appeal just because of the narrow path that the attorneys have to fight. But if they can get rule of reason integrated into this as opposed to per se, then I think there's some chance.
Yeah, great question and great answer. Thank you, Saul. Looks like Robert Weichelt, you were next with your hand up, good sir.
Hey, thank you so much. Hey, Saul, man, I tell you, we've known each other a long time. I appreciate you. Thank you for your service to this country. Thank you to your service for your local, your state, and your national support of the real estate industry. It's just nobody does more work on that in that space than I've ever seen than you. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Robert.
My question is, do you have a link that you could share, whether it be following you on Facebook or a blog or a podcast, any kind of links you could drop in the chat box that we could follow you and stay in tune, because this is not just a, hey, here's what's up. Okay, I'm good forever. This is something that we need to continually work on. And it's a muscle that we're going to need to really work out to be the agent that we need to be. So if you could drop anything in the chat box in terms of links, that would be super appreciative. But I just truly, from the bottom of my heart, want to thank you for everything you do.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate it, Robert. Like I said, say hi to your brother and your mother for me. And we've known each other for a long time. Yeah, I'm on Facebook. I have a real estate group on Facebook called Real Talk. It's called Real Towns Real Talk. And so if you go to, you can join that group. I have a Facebook page, but they limit you to 5,000 on that page, and that's a tough one. But I also have a presence on LinkedIn. So you can see I post everything I post on Facebook. I also post on LinkedIn. And then I have a blog or a website, and that domain is thedataadvocate.com. thedataadvocate.com. And we've started to post there just about everything as we write it and create it. And you're right. I had a conversation with my business partner, John Riley, just yesterday about having just a resource, because these cases are popping out every day. We're seeing new cases, and where do you go to find out who the plaintiffs are, who the defendants are, what's the nature of the case? And there's just too many of them happening too quickly. So we're trying to create a resource so people can at least do their own research, provide them with links and information. So the dataadvocate.com, that's our favorite spot. And then on the other social media channels, I'm there every day. I get up at 4 every morning just because I enjoy writing and posting, and it also means I'm done by noon, right?
And Saul, is there a best way for us to support you in what you're doing?
I think
would you prefer presence in one area versus the other?
I think that if you just follow me on the Data Advocate, that's the best thing you can do. We'll put information out there, and you can all send me email anytime you want. I respond to all my email, and I try to do it in as prompt a manner as possible. I have many email addresses. I was actually one of the people who introduced email to the real estate industry. Believe it or not, somebody had to do that. And my email address is saul@bettercallsaul.realtor. saul@bettercallsaul.realtor. And that will get to me. And like I said, I'll answer any email that you send. I'll get right back to you.
Perfect. And real quick, Jerry, it looks like you had your hand up next. You want to go ahead and fire off your question?
Yeah. So, by the way, thank you so much for being on this call. I find it interesting, being a member for over 30 years with NAR. I mean, I'm not the brightest guy out there, but if you look at the transcripts of the court case and the defense and the attorneys, I wanted to say, just the lack of questions that could have been answered. Even some of the things that you guys brought up now, like Joseph and you, some of those questions weren't, asked from some of the, the witnesses that were on the stand. It's just, I find that representation that we got from NAR and the attorneys, I mean, I don't know. It didn't seem like a lot of the great questions were asked, right? So that's one. And the other thing I'm a little bit excited about is, as we can see over the years, the compensation to the buyer's agent, especially in the seller's market, is practically dwindled away, right? I mean, 1.5% offer. Now I have the ability to negotiate my commission, right? So, which is going to be pretty powerful. And then lastly is the conflict between our forms, especially the listing agreement, and inputting them into the MLS, because there's that conflict that we've all known about for years. So that change between our contracts, which I highly love them, right? But when you go to input them into the MLS, the data, there's that conflict, right? Of between the listing agreement, just to mention one, and when we input them into the MLS, that disclosing of who pays what is eliminated when you put it in the MLS, especially in California, right? So those are kind of my main 3 thoughts. Just want to see what you thought about some of those things.
Yeah, so let's go back to the first one. And then you're gonna have to remind me of the other two. So I'm old, right? So the first one is that I don't disagree, although I wasn't there, so it's hard to judge, legal counsel and their approach. I know that there were certain things that the judge didn't allow.
Yeah.
Like one is the fact that there's state law in Missouri, actually in California, that makes it legal for the listing agent to compensate the broker that represents the buyer. That's the law. The attorneys were prohibited from letting the jury know that. Now, it's kind of strange, although I heard that the judge used to be a class action attorney himself.
Yeah.
So maybe that's got something to do with it. So were they the best? I know this about NAR. I gave advice to NAR back in 2008 when the Department of Justice was suing NAR over virtual office websites and data display. And I met with the legal counsel and I gave them my perspective as a real estate broker. And NAR had the best counsel that money could buy. And I have no reason to doubt that NAR, and when we say NAR, who is it really? It's the staff and then the elected officers that kind of run the organization year after year. That I have no doubt that they chose who they believed to be the best representatives for them that money could buy.
Right.
And so, did they ask? Yeah, maybe I would have asked if I would have been allowed to. The question is, right? What did the judge allow and not allow? And I just don't know enough about it. But I'm very confident that they didn't, that NAR didn't hedge based on money, right? They didn't pick the cheapest attorney. They went out and picked what they believe would be the best. And so your second question was,
this, I think, it's pretty exciting now when these changes made, being able to negotiate our commission, because if you look at the buy side commission, it's been dwindling, right? So being able to know your value and be able to, like you said, negotiate for them and represent, I think that higher level of service that we bring our buyers is going to be the positive part out of this.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think too, one of the things that the current system does is it rewards mediocrity.
Yeah.
Interesting. And so this might be a welcome change for everybody, right? And then one of the things we hear this conversation often about, it's too easy to get in real estate and we need to raise the dues to $10,000 a year so we can get rid of right? I mean, you hear all these different, so I agree. This could be a positive move for the profession.
Yeah, no more sending I'm at an open house and no more sending your buyer with your business card to the open house, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
So, and I think this lastly is that the changes that we know needed to happen between great forms and being able to have those forms mirror when you input it into the MLS, right? Especially when it comes to who pays what, right? I think that's a positive thing also.
Yeah, and I think MLSs are going to change to some degree over the next couple of years.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Right, and we're going to see changes in the technology. I know I've gotten more active with our MLS here in San Diego in the last 6 months, and I'm going to be much more active with the MLS. And I've been having conversations with the different MLS vendors. In our case, Black Knight, or currently ICE, the company that provides our main MLS service. And I know that there are big changes coming down the line. So a lot of them probably also will have to do with what gets displayed on the compensation side.
Yeah.
But there's big changes coming that a lot of us aren't even aware of. When we look at the mortgage market, when we look at what Zillow's doing, what CoStar's doing, and what people have never even heard of ICE, the Intercontinental Exchange, the company that owns the New York Stock Exchange, that just bought Black Knight, which is Paragon, which has like 200 MLS contracts, and where that's all going, and the idea of a spot market and a futures market in real estate, and what's going to really happen over the long run to the GSEs, to Fannie and Freddie. Boy, there's some really interesting things coming down the pike.
Yeah, well, we had the paradigm shift in the mortgage crash, but now this is going to need the paradigm shift that I think we need, right?
Yeah.
So, yep.
Awesome. And then I know there was one last question. Danielle, if you're still on and you wanted to fire off your question that you had, because you had your hand raised.
It's more subjective I just wonder, like in our country, right? We have organized unions that are allowed to advocate for their members and have a certain amount of pay. And then within those unions, when they work with government agencies, they're allowed to, have a say in who the government is going to hire, and they have to follow a certain set of rules. They have to pay a certain wage. And that's the cost of doing business. I'm not against the unions. I'm just saying that they have, it's something that is done and it's legal and it's accepted. And I'm just wondering, like, what would, not that it's identical, but I think there's some thing to be said that, as the real estate agency in this country, that we should be offered the same, not privilege, but the same ability to organize and have, be able to have to do real estate the way we've been doing it. Maybe there needs to be updates done, maybe adapt to new ideas and policies, but to have such drastic changes just seems like we're being called out for something that maybe other people that are organized aren't. I don't know, Saul, if you.
Yeah, I can kind of comment on that. I don't think you're wrong about that. That's one of the reasons I'm such an advocate for our realtor organizations. It's the best thing we got to represent us. And while we do get pressure and when you go back and you look at the history of antitrust litigation, it goes back in the real estate industry to the late 60s. And I've got books. I've got 3 volumes of antitrust cases against we don't even realize how much the government has looked to regulate the real estate industry. And for what purpose? It's like hard to say. What's the impetus behind it? Some might, we can create conspiracy theory. We can say the IRS doesn't like the fact that we're independent contractors and we don't do our quarterlies. And so they want to change us all to employees, but the National Association of Realtors fights them all the time, right? There's probably a number of different interests within the government that would rather see changes to the status quo than to allow it to remain the status quo. And it's not necessarily fair. And then when you look at the real estate industry itself, look at, attorneys, and we hear this argument that attorneys charge 25 to 50% when they work on contingency. And yet realtors work on contingency and they charge, 5 to 7% and everybody's down on them. But it's contingency based, and other people who work on contingency or consignment take a much bigger chunk. And then you throw into the equation that because you're an independent contractor or not an employee, you have no benefits. And so nobody's putting money away for you. Nobody's paying your taxes for you. Nobody's putting, creating a retirement account for you. And you only get paid when the deal closes. And so so the whole structure of the industry is kind of, to me, there's flaws in it. And yet we figured out a way to make it work.
Yep. And
it does work, and it's created an incredible marketplace. And yet we have this pressure from the government. And see what the government's done here is they've kind of taken the DOJ's kind of taken a back seat because it's got this civil litigation going for it now. And so it's letting the civil litigation take hold. And then if the FTC and the DOJ don't like what they see, they'll step in, and they might have to step in because from the litigation side, it might go too far. And by going too far, be totally detrimental to consumers. And then you might see the DOJ and the FTC. So I don't know if I addressed your point, but I think you're right. We should have the ability. People who belong to realtor organizations their organization should be able to represent them. And I think ours do to the greatest degree possible. But I think now, for a number of reasons, we're being challenged. And it's an old argument that's got more impetus because the market's been so good here in the last 10 years.
Well, Saul, I got to thank you again for your time with us today, your brilliance, quite honestly, your ability to not only be such a pioneer in our industry, but continuing to pour back into us as agents. Thank you for, like, literally from the bottom of my heart. I really want to say thank you for joining us today. And I want to know how we can support you and all that you're doing. So if there's anything I can ever do, Saul, I want you to know I'm in debt and I'm happy to do it. We'll definitely have you back on in the future because this was one of the best meetings we probably have ever had. And I want to just say that the 3 takeaways that I had from today, again, are we need to really triple down on understanding our value and communicating it. We really need to brush up on our ability to negotiate. And finally, not only do we need to continue to have our membership in our local, state, and national association of realtors, I think we really need to take it on now that we need to go and fight for it even online. Because when there are unquestioned keyboard warriors out there, you can start to change minds and not realize it. So I think we need to all really step up and say, okay, if we understand how important this is, not only to us as individual practicing real estate professionals, but what this actually means for homeownership in the United States, we need to get out there and have that fight. So, Saul, thank you again for everything. You are incredible, and you are really, really great at helping us understand how to navigate through all this. So thank you again. I want to remind everyone, next Monday, please be on here with your business plans done so we can all pour into each other. Saul, this Monday Mastermind is available to anyone, anytime. If for any reason you see a topic you want to join in on, we'd love to have you again.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks for the offers. And thanks for sticking around for an hour and listening. I appreciate it.
Hey, it's our pleasure and our honor. Thank you. Have a happy Monday, everyone. We'll see you next week. Thank you again, Saul. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Cool.